I'm Dion Mungo, and I'm interviewing a legendary Cleveland activist, Mr. Don Freeman. How are you, Mr. Freeman?
Oh, I'm doing well, thank you.
Good, good. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to meet you. Could you just take some time to just share a bit about yourself?
Well, essentially born and raised in Cleveland. Graduated from Linville High School in 1957, and again matriculated at Case Western Reserve University after that. Graduated from Case Western Reserve University in 1961 with a major in history. And I taught in Cleveland City School District for approximately 4 years. And due to political involvement and political factors, although I was regarded as an excellent teacher, I was fired in 1965 and essentially professionally blackballed for almost 2 years. But a woman named Marchie B. Lewis, who was director of League Park Center in the Huff area, she had the courage to go to bat for me to the extent where I was finally hired at League Park Center as neighborhood worker. And she further was an advocate on my behalf in terms of me becoming director in 1969, January of 1969. And I was director for about 35 years and retired at the end of 2004.
Okay. Could you shed some light on your interests through your involvement in education and further?
Well, essentially, I have been ultra politically involved since 1960. Essentially, let's say that the prelude to my ultra involvement was my support of the sit-ins in February of 1960. And from that, I just became more involved, more ultra involved in what was initially called, what was called the Civil Rights Movement, but I prefer to define it as the African American liberation struggle.
How did that bleed over into what you were able to educe in the children that you taught?
Well, essentially, I strive to inspire them to think, first of all,
Right.
And not be indoctrinated.
Right.
And in terms of thinking and not being indoctrinated, strive to inspire them to read as many different sources as possible, not just one,
Right.
and take one person's or one author's word as the word, and to think critically.
Okay. Backtracking a little bit to your younger days, was that something that was introduced to you as a character trait to have, to be a critical thinker? Was that something that your parents or your grandparents instilled in you to do at a young age?
Well, let me just say that what is a major factor with me was I, from age 10 on, have been an avid reader. And by avid, I mean ultra avid in terms of history, for instance. I read all the different sources of history that I possibly can, and therefore strive to have as comprehensive an understanding and knowledge of history as possible.
And were you alone in this, or was this something that you had a group of friends that did that in your neighborhood?
Well, let me indicate, to a significant degree, I'm definitely a person that's been self-educated, educated myself.
Okay. Could you give us some insight on where you grew up at?
Yeah, I grew up in what I choose to call the bricks, which essentially was the Southway Home Housing Project, Cleveland Metropolitan Housing Authority, in the Central area. First, I lived on 40th Street near Scoville, what was called Scoville then, now Community College. And then around the age 8, moved to Outhwaite and basically grew up on Outhwaite until my father was making too much money to be allowed to stay in the projects any longer. So he had to buy a home in the Glenville area. So from then on, I've been in the Glenville area, except for a period of 4 years. When I first started teaching, I lived in Huff for 2 years, then East Cleveland, and then since 1965, I've been back in the Glenville area at the same residence.
So growing up, was there a demographic shift when you moved from the housing authority to your house in Glenville?
Well, there were, after World War II, especially in the 1950s, consistently more African Americans who could afford, were able to afford to move out of the Central area into the Glenville area.
Okay.
And of course, my family was one.
Okay. Yep. And taking a dive into your early education life, what was school like for you?
Well, I would prefer to respond to that question from standpoint of from my 5th grade year at the age 10, going on 11, I started becoming an avid reader, and then once that occurred, that enabled me to pretty much be near or at the top of my classes in elementary school and then in junior high school as well.
Was it a competitive educational environment where you were at? Like people were trying to vie to be valedictorian or the head of their class, or was that just something that you just had a strong desire to do, was just perform proficiently in school?
Well, I just tried to do my best.
Okay.
Just tried to do my best.
Yep. What was the population around you? Were you in a mixed group? Were there Indian people or Chinese people or black people?
Okay, let me indicate that until junior high school, I was basically in the Central area, which is where African Americans were restricted in terms of where we could live, most of us. So the schools that I went to, elementary schools, First Case Woodland, and then Outhwaite, were African American,
Okay.
you know, in terms of their enrollment. Now, through the efforts of my mother, I was able to go to Alexander Hamilton, which essentially was multi-ethnic in terms of Jewish, Italian, even Syrians, in terms of Alexander Hamilton, and then a significant percentage of African Americans, but definitely not the majority at Alexander Hamilton. So that was quite a different experience than having gone to elementary schools that were all African American.
Right. So I hear you talk about your mom, and she was an advocate in putting you in this whole new environment.
Yes.
Could you describe and give us a description of your family and your upbringing?
Well, I would like to make a particular comment about my father to begin with. When I was born, it was the tail end of the Depression, 1939, because the Depression didn't end until American war economy in World War II. That's what got the United States out of the Depression. So in conjunction with that, although my father was confined to working in maintenance at Lakeside Hospital where I was born, when I was born, he was striving to get better and higher employment. And at that time, A. Philip Randolph, to make that possible for my father and thousands upon thousands of other African Americans, A. Philip Randolph was threatening to march on Washington, D.C. if the discrimination and exclusion of African Americans from employment in what are known as the defense industries didn't cease. So fortunately, that meant that in 1941, I guess the month must have been around September 1941, my father was allowed to begin working at one of the major machine industry companies in the United States, Warner and Swasey. And in terms of how difficult it was for African Americans at the time, he was investigated by the FBI before he could gain employment at Warner and Swasey. He's one of the first African Americans to be able to work at Warner and Swasey, where he worked for almost 40 years till his retirement. So that gets you in a situation in terms of how things were for African Americans in my early years.
And coming from a space where you're saying he worked at this job professionally for 40 years, what was your mother's involvement in helping helping you guys mature, dealing with what he had to deal with?
Well, that's interesting too, because at a certain point, my mother started working. She worked at an electrical company called Electroline. And it had a very militant union, electrical workers union. In fact, the leadership of the union, of her union, were persecuted as communists. And it was regarded as, a left-wing communist union. So that she became aware of people who were, I say, persecuted by the government, because this is the post-World War II era of the Cold War, and American workers who had, I would say, even progressive, let alone radical and leftist orientations, were in danger of losing their jobs, in some cases even being in prison. So those were the times in which I grew up in.
So it seems like, as I listen, you have your parents, and eventually you would come in contact with the government a lot.
Well, let's say I indicated the situation in terms of Philip Randolph
Right.
and my father, and then later my soulmate choosing to work at electrical line that had a very militant union,
Right.
the Electrical Workers Union. So that resulted in her familiarity with essentially what was politically ensuing in Cleveland as well as the rest of the United States.
Do you think having the knowledge of political involvement in being in a workspace at a young age helped you to have the emotional intelligence to deal with it when it came knocking at your door later on in life?
Well, I would definitely say that it helped. It definitely helped.
We talked about dark times, we talked about your parents. Could you share some of your best memories in your evolution as an activist and as a man in Cleveland?
Well, I choose to concentrate on a particular book that I read, written by Richard Wright, had a profound influence on me. It was called The Color Curtain. Now, The Color Curtain was Richard Wright's book, which reported on and described the conference of African and Asian leaders at Bandung, Indonesia in 1955. This conference was a major conference of the post-World War II era in terms of the struggle, the anti-colonial struggle against imperialism and European control of Africa and Asia. And it essentially was attended by liberated leaders of liberated African and Asian nations. So there were no European nations involved in this conference. It was all people of color. And Adam Clayton Powell, African American congressman, was invited as an observer at this conference. This conference laid the foundation for the further progress of the struggle of African and Asian nations to liberate themselves from European colonialism, European imperialism, and had a tremendous impact on me in terms of causing me to become very critical of the political behavior internationally of the United States and other European countries. Or other European countries, the United States and other Western countries.
Well, shedding light on such a life-changing experience and memory, how did that transition to when you taught?
All right, well, I wanted my students to be informed and aware of what was happening throughout the world,
Right.
especially in Africa and Asia.
Right.
In fact, I was one of the early political opponents of American imperialism in Vietnam, Indochina. And I, at a certain juncture, started making comments in my classes, as well as striving to enable my students to know where these places were in their names. I made the comment to my students, you better be careful and aware of the fact that at some point you may be drafted into the armed forces and sent somewhere that if you don't listen in my classes, you won't even know the name of the place that you're sent to fight and possibly die in.
Right.
And that's the case in Vietnam, because there were soldiers and other military personnel that were sent to Vietnam and didn't know where Vietnam was until they were sent there. You know, that's how, let's put it this way, ignorant the United States allowed Americans to be in terms of what was happening in the world. In fact, it was, in terms of the people who control the United States, advantageous that people be ignorant.
And where was the school that you enlightened these young minds at?
Kennard Junior High School, the area where I grew up, 46, between Community College and Althwaite, where I taught for 4 years.
So this hit home. This was like you administering legacy in a way that wasn't administered to you at a young age.
Correct. Absolutely correct.
And what methods did you use as you were teaching that kind of set you apart?
Well, see, first of all, fortunately, at Kennard Junior High School, the principal allowed the students to participate in extracurricular and after-school clubs. And I chose to create an African American history club.
Okay.
So students could learn about what they weren't taught in the curriculum after school in the club based on them joining. But progressively, I started not only teaching African American and African history in the club, but in my classes as well. So that became, let's say, a little dangerous in terms of being non-acceptable as the established curriculum was. And ultimately, it was a factor in terms of me being fired for the alleged teaching of black supremacy in my classes, in terms of allegations that I was teaching black supremacy in my classes.
Wow. So the narrative was changed from you enlightening young African American minds of where they come from and things other than the sort via Vietnam and other things like that into this is dangerous speech.
Well, let's just say that at the time that I was teaching in the Cleveland Public Schools, African and African American history, had not yet become acceptable parts of the curriculum, and it had not yet become included in the curriculum. So, therefore, were considered inappropriate for the classes at the time.
And what curriculum was taught in history? What different historical events did you guys touch on?
Well, there were standard American textbooks which essentially, I would say, provided a conservative, not even liberal, but a conservative perspective and rendition of American history. And that's what students, it really, I would say, was indoctrination rather than historical truth. And that varied depending on the particular period of history. There's one particular period of history was atrocious in terms of how biased the historians were in the kind of depiction and rendition that was in the history books. And that's the Reconstruction period after after the Civil War. The period from 1865 to 1877 was atrocious in terms of how that was taught throughout the United States, not just in the Cleveland schools.
Right.
Atrocious.
Right.
And I want to stress, that's why a book that I read had such a profound impact upon me in terms of getting my head screwed on right in terms of the Reconstruction period, and that was Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction, a must-read for all Americans, even though it was published in the 1930s.
Right. And did you touch on giving them identification of Black Reconstruction in your in the club that you had started?
Yes. Yes.
And were you the only club that offered that at the time, or were there other organizations?
And I can't say
that
for other cities, I can't say for other schools throughout the system. But I would say that if there were other schools that had African and African American history clubs, you could probably count them on one hand throughout the system.
Were the parents advocates for this?
Well, they were ignorant of what was going on, just like the children.
Okay.
But progressively, they started appreciating what I was teaching their children. In fact, there was significant support by the parents at Kennard Junior High School to reinstate me when I was fired, when I was first dismissed and then fired as a teacher. The PTA at Kennard was in my corner, you know, in terms of supporting me at Kennard. So I had tremendous support from both parents and students at Kennard in terms of them opposing me being fired
Right.
as a teacher at Kennard.
Right.
And in terms of obviously my political associations and my political philosophy and environment, and my political philosophy and involvement.
And were your principal and your administration at your school also advocating for you during this time
No.
frame?
No, they were afraid of me. They were afraid of me. Yeah, they were afraid of Don Freeman.
And in you pushing this Black African education, did that object to the pushing of athletics within the Black community at that time?
State your question again.
What you were trying to administer to the kids from an educational standpoint, did that conflict with kids wanting to play sports like it is now? Like, kids more are worried about basketball or football than actually getting an education. So during your time in this time frame, was it were kids either going for sports or going for athletics?
Okay, let me respond to your question a certain way.
Okay.
The best way to respond to your question is to emphasize that the present state, the present deplorable state of affairs in terms of the acculturation of Americans, and especially African Americans, is a product and a consequence of the mass communication media's emphasis on sports and essentially influencing Americans, but especially African Americans, to be so focused on basketball. And of course, football along with it, but especially basketball in terms of so many African American male youth, and now more and more female youth being interested in becoming basketball superstars.
Yep.
But that cannot be attributed to me in my teaching. That essentially is a consequence of the evolution of the mass communication media in this society, and the ultra emphasis on sports. And let me indicate, that is a further indication of this being a capitalist society in which the profit motive is foremost, and sports are promulgated and disseminated in such an extreme manner because it's profitable. You're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry in terms of sports.
Yes, sir.
Mega multi-million dollars.
Yes, sir. Well, it's been an honor. That's all the questions that I have for you at the moment. I want to change hands and allow Vanessa to connect with you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
So talk a bit about your familiarity with the struggle for social justice in education in Cleveland.
Well, essentially, what I want to do, since you provided me with the opportunity, is to deal with the racist class nature of this society and how that has created what is now a school system in terms of urban public school systems that students are required to attend in terms of compulsory attendance, but they're not being educated. Now, I call this process juvenicide. and by juvenicide, I mean genocide of juveniles in the public schools. Genocide that cripples them intellectually and in some cases mentally, so that when even they graduate from high school, they're crippled intellectually and mentally, and either are unemployable or they can not be employed to do more than flip hamburgers at McDonald's. Now, this has occurred because in terms of the values of this society, those who can afford to do not allow their students to continue to attend public schools in inner city neighborhoods, but they abandon those schools and move to suburban areas, put their students in suburban public schools, or if they stay in the same neighborhood residentially, they put them in parochial schools. And this means that the poor who cannot afford to do the same thing are abandoned and stuck in the inner city public schools. So essentially what has resulted is that in the United States, we have a 3-tier schooling system.
Right.
Notice I say schooling system, not necessarily education, because schooling and education are not the same.
Different things, right.
But anyway, in terms of this 3-tier schooling system, you have poor, academic, inner city public schools, poorly performing academically, inner city public schools. You have varying from mediocre to decent schooling in suburban public school systems, and some parochial schools. And then you have a separate elite
Right.
school system for the wealthy, for the affluent, who are able to enroll their children in private schools. And they're the ones they're the students who get as close to an education as is feasible in the United States.
Right.
So in terms of social injustice, this juvenicide process that I'm talking about, they now call it the essentially system whereby students attend public schools and end up in prison. So the school to prison pipeline,
Right.
that's what this juvenicide process is. And the less said, the better, the toll that it has taken, especially on African American male youth, in terms of the millions.
Right. So when you mention the roots in race and class. Like, what were the circumstances that you can recall when this first began to be prominent and visible in Cleveland schools?
In the 1960s.
Okay, talk
In
about
the
that.
in the 1960s. Now, of course, the racist aspect really hit the fan with the death of Bruce Clunder in 1964, in terms of him being bulldozed in what was to be a school of discrimination at Stephen Howe in the Glenville area, where African Americans would be required to go. And there was not an integration of African Americans throughout the system in terms of them going to schools that were not totally, almost exclusively African American in enrollment, but in terms of there being a more balanced enrollment between African Americans and European Americans. And as a result of that, African Americans were getting a lesser education than European Americans in Cleveland.
So talk about your familiarity with like the political resistance to desegregation, like from the mayor Locher? I don't know how to pronounce
Okay,
his
Locher.
name. Locher, okay.
Okay. Well, see, let me indicate a particular person that was key in terms of your question, was the president of the Cleveland Board of Education at the time that Bruce Clunder was assassinated. And that was Ralph McAllister,
Okay.
who essentially utilized his involvement in the Cleveland Public Schools for political purposes and reasons beyond just being a board member. He ran for the Cleveland mayor in 1965 against Carl B. Stokes and Locher. And when he was defeated at that, then he went on to become a judge. So he was using his involvement in the Cleveland City School District to further his political nest and his political career, which obviously he was ultimately able to do in terms of becoming a judge,
He became a
common pleas judge. Fortunately, he wasn't able to become mayor.
wow. So what about the relationship between the mayor, the Board of Education, and the parents? Like, what were some of the parental concerns that they brought up, and maybe like, you know, like all the reneging that went on, these promises that were being made in terms of, oh, we'll fix this segregated situation?
Well, let me put it this way. Unfortunately, and I have to say, it hurts me to have to say it, this was even the case with Mayor Carl B. Stokes, what I'm about to say. The mayors, until Michael White was different. They did not regard their involvement in bringing about decent, genuine education in the Cleveland City School District as a political priority.
Okay.
They left that to the superintendent and the Board of Education. That's all the mayors prior to Michael White. Michael White was different. Unfortunately, he went overboard, though, in terms of eliminating the Board of Education
Right.
and mayor control of the schools, which was definitely wrong.
Right.
He was wrong in going overboard. His interest initially as mayor of Cleveland was definitely, let's say, a plus. But then when he decided that, no, we need to get rid of the Board of Education, the elected Board of Education, he went too far.
Was that part of the state takeover?
Okay, the state took over and let the mayor run the district.
Gotcha.
That's the state takeover part.
Gotcha.
It
Okay.
was state
So
action.
it was his
It was
decision.
it's state. He urged the state to give him the power,
Okay.
and the state did.
Okay.
And that, unfortunately, that still exists today in terms of the mayor
Right.
controlling the district
Right.
by law.
What about what about your familiarity with the half-day classes or the relay classes?
Well, see, let me put it this way. I want to start with the Huff area and the fact that there were not enough elementary schools in the Huff area in the early 1960s. So that meant since there weren't enough elementary schools in the Huff area, it was primarily just 2 elementary schools. Now, in Huff, we use terminology West Huff and East Huff. The western part of Huff, the lower part of Huff, and the eastern part of Huff, the upper part of Huff. It was just 2 elementary schools, really. One elementary school for lower or West Huff, Dunham Elementary School, and one elementary school for East Huff, Huff Elementary School. Now, all the students who lived in the Huff area, the thousands and thousands upon thousands of elementary school age Huff children had to go to one of those schools.
What was the name of the West?
The west one was Dunham.
Dunham.
Dunham Elementary School in 66 in Lexington. And that was the one that was most critical, first of all, in terms of the first nitty-gritty school that had relay classes,
Okay.
half-day classes for students, Dunham Elementary School. Now, that was rectified later by the addition of at least 4 more elementary schools later. 4 more elementary schools later. But in the early 1960s, it was just the 2.
Right.
So that was the case. And then in the Glenville, you had the increasing African American population in Glenville, which made it difficult for schools like Hazeldale to have sufficient space for all the students. And then they put them on buses, sent them out to Little Italy, and they obviously weren't wanted in Little Italy, and there was a violent eruption there in terms of the presence of African Americans from Hazeldale in in Little Italy.
Okay.
Yeah.
What were the schools like on the west side during that same time?
Well, in terms of racism and discrimination, overall, schools on the west side were better. Better in terms of the type of schooling, the availability of materials and resources. They were definitely had advantages for the students compared with schools on the east side.
Were parents and teachers aware that they had empty classrooms on the west side?
Well, let me indicate. See, this is all part of the racism,
Right.
discrimination. Uh, The, the superintendent and the board kept it that way. And no, and in terms of any moving of students, one of the few schools that they sent students to was Little Italy, and of course they weren't wanted there.
Right.
So it was a situation where African Americans were confined to schools in the African American populated areas.
Who was the superintendent at that time?
Well, see, we're talking about two superintendents primarily. We're talking about Dr. Levinson, who was superintendent. Well, there was a superintendent prior to him named Mark Scherner in the 50s. But essentially, in the 1950s, the question of discrimination and segregation wasn't raised in the 50s. The question was brought up in the early 60s.
Okay.
That's when Levinson, Dr. William Levinson, had become superintendent. And of course, the death of Bruce Condor ended his superintendency,
Okay.
his career as superintendent of the Cleveland Public Schools. But the less said, the better what happened after Levinson. I want to explain it this way because it's very important that people understand what I'm about to say in terms of how it ultimately became the foundation for the deplorable state of Cleveland Public Schools today. When Bruce Condor was assassinated, the powers that be decided that Levinson had to go. So he pretty much was forced to resign. And in his place, the powers that be, and one of the key factors when I say powers that be at the time, I'm talking about the plain dealer and the Cleveland Press, along with the plain dealer, were instrumental in giving the imported superintendent from Parma, Paul Briggs, a carte blanche or blank check to run the Cleveland public schools as he chose. And more, he was rubber stamped by the Board of Education, especially after Ralph McAllister left to run for mayor in 1965. So from 1966 on, Paul W. Briggs had a blank check to pretty much run the Cleveland public schools as he chose. And he ultimately ran them in the ground. He built schools. He built more schools. But the quality academically of the schools did not improve with the increase in the number of schools. And I want to say one thing about what I'm commenting on. One example of the mediocrity of Paul W. Briggs as superintendent academically, his academic mediocrity, was the head of the Department of Curriculum. I think his name was Ritchie. I don't know if it was Dr. Ritchie, but I think his name was Ritchie. He resigned. And Paul W. Briggs was so nonplussed in dealing with his resignation that he didn't even bother to select
Oh, wow.
a successor to Richie. And this was brought to my attention by a frat brother of mine who we were both alphas, Alpha Phi Alpha. But he was working for the district. He brought it to my attention. And what I did was write a recommendation that I gave to Arnold Pinckney to essentially cause Paul W. Briggs to select a new curriculum, a new head of the Department of Curriculum, because he wasn't even concerned with doing that.
Right.
The curriculum department did not have a director until essentially I wrote a recommendation. And it couldn't be known that I wrote it. It was, I wrote it for Arnold Pinckney.
Okay.
And Arnold Pinckney basically presented it. And as a result, the first African-American assistant superintendent was essentially selected for that position. But that just shows you how unconcerned
Right.
Paul W. Briggs was with the nitty-gritty in terms of what's necessary to maintain academic quality in the district. He basically was focused on building schools, building more buildings, bricks
As if
and
that
mortar,
was the
bricks and
to
mortar,
relieve the
bricks and
problem.
mortar,
Right.
rather than academic excellence.
So how were parents and folks in the community organizing to resist, these decisions that were being made by the board? And how are you involved?
Okay, that's a good example. Good question. Let me stress that after the freedom schools of 1964 and Cleveland Corps' involvement in desegregating the Cleveland public schools diminished. Collective public involvement diminished. And people more and more, as I've indicated before, those who could afford to remove their children from the Cleveland public schools and abandon the Cleveland public schools rather than organizing themselves
Okay.
to improve the Cleveland public schools.
Okay.
And so that has been the case ever since.
So to backtrack a little bit, you mentioned the boycott. So do you think that was because maybe the boycott was seen as like a failure? And so folks were just like, all right, we got to go.
No, the boycott wasn't seen as a failure. But struggle is difficult to sustain,
Right.
which meant that after the boycott of the Cleveland City School District in April of 1964, Cleveland Corps and other organizations, for varying reasons, diminished their involvement in striving to bring about change in the Cleveland City School District. And when they diminished their involvement, then the public overall ceased, didn't involve themselves on the same level
Okay.
as they had before.
So can you talk a bit about the boycott and the organizing for the boycott?
Well, let me say that, needless to say, there was an immediate violent eruption in the area near the school site, Stephen Howe. This violent eruption occurred in the Glenville area.
And that's where Reverend Clunder was assassinated.
He was assassinated on the Stephen Howe school site as they were building Stephen Howe in the Glenville area. Now, immediately after he was assassinated, there was a violent eruption in the Glenville area near the site. Now, in terms of that violent eruption, the powers that be interceded and intervened in terms of a number of things that they did. One was import Paul W. Briggs and give him a carte blanche to run the district as he saw fit. And then they did what was necessary in terms of organizing the establishment to give him the necessary backing to do so, and to also do whatever they could think to do to strive to co-opt the militants and remove them from the street.
So, the militants, like, how are they able to organize 92% participation in the boycott? How are they able to, set up space for students to go to instead of the schools? Make
Well,
sure
of
the
course.
students were safe, have a curriculum. Like, are you familiar with any of that planning? Did you play a role in any of that?
Okay, let me respond by saying that I could not directly participate myself because I was already under surveillance
Right.
in terms of my political activities. But a colleague of mine
Okay.
was very instrumental in this process of setting up the Freedom Schools. His name was Dr. Bernard Mandel. And of course, with his doctorate and all of his tenure in the district, he couldn't be touched in terms of any attempt to intimidate him or harass him.
Okay.
So he was able, with others, to organize the Freedom Schools. Now, of course, instrumental in the participation that was necessary to provide facilities for the Freedom Schools was the involvement of churches, because numerous Freedom Schools were in churches, so that the clergy had to be involved. But the key is the public was receptive and amenable to the Freedom Schools because of their outrage
Okay.
at Bruce Clunder having been assassinated. That basically resulted in a public outcry. And that outcry was expressed in the Freedom Schools being able to happen.
Okay. And so was there like a relationship with the churches that allowed for that space for the young people to use that
The
day?
answer is yes.
Okay.
Now you have to remember that the clergy were responding to the death of one of their colleagues, a clergyman,
Right.
Reverend Bruce Clinton.
Right.
So automatically that would make them amenable and receptive
Okay.
to their churches being used for that process.
Okay. Okay. So you weren't able to participate in the event itself.
Correct.
So how was that, what was that day like for you? What do you remember from that day?
Well, see, I had to make sure I didn't get fired.
Right.
I had to go to school and teach,
Okay.
to empty classes,
Wow.
to empty classes.
Empty classes.
Yeah, there were just a handful of students that came to my classes all day. So that was the situation for me, but that was by necessity.
When the students came back, what did they tell you? Did they tell you anything about the Freedom Schools or their experience? Or did you overhear any?
Well, I knew the people involved in the Freedom School, so I knew what was going on from them.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I found out what was going on in Freedom School. Started with Dr. Bernard Mandel,
Okay.
who I knew very well.
Right. But like, were the young people like, were they excited? Were they scared? How do you think they experienced?
Well, I would say that human beings tend, most part, to return to normal.
Okay.
You know, that's basically how human beings tend to involve, how they tend to relate to most events.
Okay.
You know, it happened and then they went back to normal.
Okay. Okay. Well, what about the community? What do you think the general feeling about the boycott was in the community?
Well, it was supported, but you see, I keep getting back to Cleveland Corps and United Freedom Movement, along with Cleveland Corps. It was up to them to sustain what had, let's say, ensued from the time of the assassination of Reverend Bruce Clunder. And they were not able to sustain it at the level that it had reached with the boycott. Weren't able to sustain that level of involvement.
Was it because of like a difference in like approach? Like I read that, you know, most of the core members were more for direct action and protest, and you know, some of the other folks that were involved with the United Freedom Movement were from the old school leadership, black leadership in the community that were used to negotiating.
Well, let me just stress this. CORE was in the forefront, but after the boycott, there was only so much else that Cleveland Corps could think of to do
Okay.
beyond what they had already done.
Okay.
And as a result of the limits as to their political creativity, they weren't able to sustain that high level of involvement
Okay.
in terms of the public.
What about the death of Randy Atkins? Did that have anything to do with their inability to sustain that momentum?
I would say no. I would say no.
Okay.
I would say no.
Okay. And one of the questions that was raised by one of the team members was, you know, when Reverend Clunder was murdered, like over 2,000 people showed up that night. You know, there was like all of this rallying.
Yes. Yeah, at Corey Methodist Church.
Right. And she was wondering, you know, would the outcry and would the support have been the same if he were black? So I was wondering, was there that kind of support for Randy Atkins' family? Like, how did the community
No, the answer is no.
respond?
The answer is no.
Okay. Okay. All right. So, in your opinion, what do you think was the most pressing issue for the black community during the late 1950s through the 1970s?
Late 1950s, or what you would, we said 1950s or 1960s?
1950s through the 70s. What do you think? Or did it change?
Okay, now that's a good question. Now, essentially, in terms of public participation, the death of Reverend Bruce Clunder and the aftermath of that, and of course the boycott was an integral part of the aftermath of the death of Reverend Bruce Clunder. For lack of a better term, that was one of the highlights of public participation during the 1960s in Cleveland. Now, there were other struggles, but they didn't reach the level that the boycott represented. One of those was in the construction industry, getting African Americans hired as construction workers, and especially as it related to becoming apprentices and journeymen in construction unions. That was a struggle that was subsequent to that was a struggle that increased subsequently to the boycott. In fact, I'm going to take this opportunity to get personal. I said that the struggle to get African Americans hired in construction unions, first as apprentices and then journeymen, increased, that struggle increased after the boycott, the school boycott, meaning it had to start before the school boycott. It started in 1963, and in 1963, my brother, Roger Freeman, a younger brother of mine, who had been working at what was then Cleveland Electric Illuminating Company,
Okay.
in terms of, checking electric meters, et cetera. He had skill as an electrician, and he was selected to become an apprentice in Local 38 of the Electricians Union in Cleveland as a result of protests and militants and agitation around the hiring of African Americans to be construction workers and members of unions as apprentices and then journeymen. My brother was able to benefit from that
Okay.
and become the African American that was
Wow.
selected to be an apprentice in the Local 38 Electricians Union.
Okay.
Yeah, so my brother was one of the beneficiaries.
Okay. So, how are you a part of the activism and organizing? within our community.
Let me understand your question again further. Would you elaborate on that question?
Like, what types of things have you done in terms of activism and organizing?
Okay, I'm gonna answer your question a certain way. In October of 1962, I was instrumental in founding and creating the Afro-American Institute, which was the first black nationalist organization in Cleveland since the Universal Negro Improvement Association, started by Marcus Garvey in the he started it around 1960, but in terms of Cleveland, it was established in Cleveland, I think, in the 1920s.
Okay.
That's the Universal Negro Improvement Association. That was the first black nationalist organization in Cleveland, pretty much in the country of its kind. And then later, the Nation of Islam under the Honorable Elijah Muhammad in the 1950s in Cleveland. But those were the only two organizations of a black nationalist character that had been created in Cleveland. And then in the early 1960s, I and others created the Afro-American Institute in Cleveland, which was the first black nationalist organization since then in Cleveland.
So what were some of the highlights and challenges?
Okay, well, I'm going to respond to the question a certain way. At the time that I was developing with others the Afro-American Institute in Cleveland, after we started it in October 1962, I was also on a national level involved in the development of RAM, the Revolutionary Action Movement, nationally, as well as my involvement with the Afro-American Institute locally. Now, those two involvements merged in the month of March 1963, when the Afro-American Institute, in terms of its, let's say, convergence with RAM, we, the Afro-American Institute, were instrumental in co-sponsoring with the Socialist Workers' Party a significant event for Cleveland, and that is the presentation of William Worthy, a progressive and controversial journalist with the Baltimore African American newspaper, who had been politically persecuted for going to Cuba, which was not allowed at the time. And he went to Cuba and obviously spent time with Castro, Fidel Castro, and Che Guevara, and was persecuted by Robert Kennedy. In fact, that was one of Robert Kennedy's priorities as Attorney General when William Worthy returned. So he was he was the most controversial African American journalist in the United States at the time.
And you were responsible for
bringing him to Cleveland. And the location of the Afro-American Institute, the managers or a man and a woman, who husband and wife, who were visited on the day that William Worthy was scheduled in March 1963 to speak in the Cedar area at a place called Hubbard Memorial Hall at 84th and Cedar. The managers there, husband and wife, were visited by a Sergeant John Ungvery, who was the head of what became related to the evolution and the emergence of COINTELPRO,
Oh,
the
wow.
counterintelligence
Right.
program. But it didn't exist in 1963. But the organization, or organ, if you want to call it that, Sergeant John Ungvery, I think his first name was John Ungvery, was the head of, it was called the Subversive Squad of Cleveland Police Department. The Subversive Squad of the Cleveland Police Department. So that was one of the forerunners of COINTELPRO. And he visited the husband and wife who managed the Hubbard Memorial Hall the morning of the day that William Worthy was to speak in Cleveland that evening. And he scared the daylights out of them. They were so afraid of what he had obviously intimidated them with in his visit, that they called me at Kennard Junior High School. And I had to be called out of my class that I was teaching. And they said to me, "You can't meet here tonight."
Wow.
So I said, damn. Went back to my classes. Evidently, they had a change of heart. They called me back and said, "William Worthy can speak here, but that's the last time you can have any meeting here."
Okay.
So that was obviously the end of my relationship with what had been our headquarters, Hubbard Memorial Hall. We had to find a new headquarters. But William Worthy was ever able to speak that night, gave a dynamite presentation, which, let me stress how significant this presentation was. He advocated during his presentation that the African American liberation struggle in the United States be solidified and united with the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggles of Asians, Africans, and Latin Americans throughout the world, so that there be one international global struggle of all peoples of color for total liberation of all peoples of
And he
color.
said that in Cleveland.
Correct. Yeah. So you can see that was super powerful, super dynamite. So that's also meant Afro-American Institute had essentially become the RAM, Revolutionary Action Movement, cadre in Cleveland. So that, I would stress, is very significant in terms of what was happening politically in Cleveland and the nation at that time.
So, and that was in 63.
Yeah.
So do you think that some of the Hazeldale parents and some of the other parents from these neighborhoods where their kids were being discriminated against in school, like in terms of put on half-day schedules, being intact bus to Murray Hill where they were getting rocks thrown at them, do you think they were present for that speech?
By and large, no.
No?
By and large, no.
Okay. Okay.
So what we have to do is realize that African Americans were at various levels of awareness, consciousness, and understanding.
Okay.
See, that was a super high level
Right.
that was represented by the meeting that took place at Hubbard Memorial Hall on an evening of March 1963. That
Right.
was super high.
Right.
See, that was basically on a radical level. Most African Americans were not radicals.
Well, I hear that we had the largest concentration of radicals in the country, right here in
Okay.
Cleveland.
Let me indicate. I'm going to modify what you said, because I don't use the term radical loosely.
Okay.
Now, what progressively became the case is that we progressively I'm pausing to say that progressively the process emerged and expanded in Cleveland, where we had a significant existence of black nationalists.
Okay.
Now I make a distinction between black nationalists and radicals, because all black nationalists are not radicals.
Right.
Some are, some aren't.
Gotcha.
But we had a significant, we hadn't developed a significant number of black nationalists in Cleveland.
Okay. Okay. And it was mostly grassroots.
Well, let me stress what was significant is that you used the term grassroots, and I want to say that especially thanks to people like L. Ware Bay and Harlell Jones, who first started the JFK House in around 1964, early 1965. Well, I'd say late 1964, early 1965, the JFK House. They attracted youth,
Okay.
so that we, you know, a number of the black nationalists were youth and young adults in terms of the kinds of African Americans that gravitated to black nationalism in Cleveland. And of course, the organization that later was created after the JFK House ceased to exist was the Afro Set. And that's the organization headed by Harlell Jones, the Afro Set.
Okay. I have a lot more questions, but I'm probably really over time, and so I want to hand it off to Dion, who's going to talk about bringing it forward. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Speaking from a time where boycotting and being outwardly spoken against the government was so prevalent, and transitioning to now, based on your understanding and through your maturity in social justice, how does the fight continue?
Well, let me indicate a particular juncture that has become more important. And all I got to do is say the organization Black Lives Matter. Now, what am I referring to? I'm referring to what has commonly been called police brutality and the behavior of police as it relates to African American males, both youth and adult. I want to stress to you an event that, thanks to the mass communications media in the United States and how they chose to manipulate it, did not get the amount of attention and therefore significance that its magnitude requires, and it never has. I'm talking about the November 29th, 2012 murder. That's what it's tantamount to, murder, by 13 Cleveland police, firing 137 shots, unprecedented, and therefore many of them in the bodies of unarmed, non-criminal Melissa Williams and Timothy Russell. I call that the Cleveland atrocity. That, of course, occurred in a schoolyard in East Cleveland. Now, justice has never been rendered in that case. The only one of those 13 who fired the 137 shots, who has experienced any punishment whatsoever, was Michael Brillo, who fired 49 shots. Now, let's say the better that he's not convicted and in prison, thanks to a despicable judge named John O'Donnell, who's still on common pleas court and still trying to get to the Ohio Supreme Court, which I hope he never does. But Michael Brillo is the only one who has received any appreciable punishment for that atrocity. What is truly abominable and deplorable is that an organization of which I have been a member that was formed shortly after the Cleveland atrocity. It's called the Committee for Social Justice. And the Committee for Social Justice was ultimately able, in terms of advocacy and relentless militancy, to get Mayor Frank Jackson to fire 6 of the 13 perpetrators of the atrocity. And that 6 included Michael Brillo. But Michael Brillo was the only one that was the only one fired out of the 6 that Frank Jackson had fired. The arbitrators of that firing, reinstated the other 5. Only Michael Brillo was fired. The other 5 were reinstated and now walking the streets of Cleveland still as police. Now, that is gross injustice. And as a consequence, as I speak to you this afternoon, our organization, the Committee for Social Justice, is striving to get Mayor Frank Jackson to change the forthcoming contract between his administration and the Cleveland Police Patrolmen's Association so that arbitrators of cases involving police killing unarmed human beings no longer have the exclusive authority to make the decision in those cases. That's what we're striving to get as a change in the contract between the Cleveland Police Patrolmen's Association and Mayor Frank Jackson's administration. I said, as I speak to you this afternoon.
Yes, sir. What are some advice that you have for future black leaders in the struggle that we're facing right now in police brutality and things as such?
Well, I'm going to pause because you see the limits of even violent protests in cities like Baltimore and other cities as to the limits of what it can accomplish. That's why I'm emphasizing what has to be dealt with is the behavior of the arbitrators that arbitrate police behavior so that those arbitrators are accountable to the public. Unlike the arbitrator who decided that the only policeman in the Cleveland case, Michael Brillo, that should be fired. The arbitrator in the Cleveland case who decided that the only policeman who should be fired out of the 6 that the mayor fired was Michael Brillo and reinstated the other 5. We can't have that kind of behavior by arbitrators. And see, that occurs throughout the country also, not just here in Cleveland. Is that we've got to, that's one of the things that we've got to concentrate on, is if you want to use a basketball terminology, a full court press on arbitrators in terms of getting that changed so that arbitrators are made accountable to the public.
Yes, sir. How do you maintain sanity in this time?
Well, you have to be spiritual. You have to be spiritual. We have to do all we can because the Creator helps those who help themselves.
Yes, sir.
But along with doing all that we can, we have to call on the Creator for the wherewithal to keep the faith and continue the struggle.
Yes, sir.
Until, as is said in our African American anthem, we march on till victory is won.
Yes, sir. And next to faith, how to maintain financially?
Yeah, well, see, that's another challenge in terms of African Americans realizing that we need to become politically, socially, culturally, and economically interdependent on one another. That's key in terms of our liberation in a racist society. Because in a racist society, there can be no total liberation, or anywhere near total liberation of African Americans without political, economic, social, and cultural interdependence of African Americans on each other so that we become a genuine, authentic, true, real African American community, which we don't have.
Yes, sir.
We don't have real, genuine, true, authentic African American community. Which means in reality, we are not a community. African Americans are not a community. Use the word much too loosely, far too loosely, the word community. That's something that we have to aspire to, just like democracy we have to aspire to. Community and democracy, we have to aspire to both.
And your soulmate, what is some words that you can say towards stability and family, and how that aids in strength and in continuing the struggle?
Well, I want to acknowledge and pay, let's say, due commendation and praise to my soulmate as being one of the few people decades ago who realized that we have a gender problem. We African Americans have a gender problem in terms of the relationship between African American males and African American females. And until we deal with that gender problem, in terms of the conflict and discord between African American males and African American females, we're not going to have community either. That's one of the reasons why we don't have community.
Right.
It's because African American males and African American females, in far too many instances, don't get along with each other.
I agree.
Until they do, we in serious trouble.
How through your marriage and your connection with your spouse has this helped transform your outlook on what you do?
Well, we have tried to set an example. That's what we've tried to do. Because you got to walk what you talk.
Yes, sir.
So we tried to walk what we talk. You know, just like I'm saying that we need to deal with this gender problem. We need to show that my soulmate and I are together. That's one way in which we do it.
How has organization played a factor in what you've been able to accomplish in your achievements, in overcoming the struggle?
Well, let me stress, we have to keep the faith and continue the struggle. Which, in terms of keeping the faith and continuing the struggle, once we start an organization, we have to do what's necessary to sustain it.
Yes, sir.
And we haven't been doing very good at sustaining organizations, which is what we're striving to do, challenging though it is, right as I speak, with our organization, the Committee for Social Justice. You know, we've been now in existence for, I would say, about 6 years. So sustaining organizations is key. You've got to have the wherewithal spiritually and otherwise to sustain organizations.
And in your opinion, how do you properly prioritize concern and act upon those concerns?
Well, in terms of one concern that I can't discuss enough is the education of youth, especially African American youth, in terms of being a priority. One of the things we got to deal with is the school to prison pipeline. And of course, that's what I call juvenicide.
Yes, sir.
Genocide of juveniles, the educational genocide of African American youth, especially African American males. That's one of the things that we have to deal with. And we cannot deal with it as long as we have African Americans who can afford to abandoning inner city schools and putting their children in parochial schools and suburban public schools. And that process, let's say, the better how extensive it has become, so that there are few African American parents and citizens, because you can't, the education of our children cannot be dependent on just parents alone.
Right.
But we as African Americans have to have the perception and view and commitment that all African American youth are our children collectively,
Yes, sir.
whether they're biological or not. Because what happens to them determines the future of African American people. And right now, let's say the better, how it's going down the sewer because of what's happening to our youth. So we have to be concerned about relating to all African American youth as our children and doing that we can to enable them to get the education they need in order to survive personally and then for us to survive collectively.
And more personally and intimately, what is some advice that you can give young men on dealing with authority?
Young men dealing with authority?
Yes, yes, sir.
Okay, let me give this kind of answer. Because one of the factors, especially as it relates to African American male youth in the police, is, I'll use the term, mental and spiritual discipline. By mental and spiritual discipline, African American male youth need to realize that in terms of their relationship to police, never shoot from the hip. And by, I say, never shoot from the hip. Never react to police in a hot-headed, emotional manner that causes them to abuse African American youth, which is tantamount to stressing that one thing that I live by is that first, put the Creator first in our lives. Put the Creator first. And all other things will be added unto us. Put the Creator, what we know to be the higher self. You know, we are comprised of a lower self and a higher self. And our higher self is attuned and in tune with the Creator. And that's the self that we should follow, not the lower self. and to the degree that we follow our higher self that's in tune with the Creator, we will be much better off and will have made a breakthrough in terms of what's necessary for us to liberate ourselves and each other.
And lastly, my last question is, what ways can my generation pour into the next generation properly to make sure that everything you talked about, being spiritually and mentally together, aid in making sure that they are better than our generation?
All right, I think one of the major things that the younger generation and younger generations need to realize is that first and foremost, after the Creator, must come each other. Getting back to that interdependence of African Americans, politically, economically, socially, culturally, that we have to realize that after the Creator, all that we fundamentally have is each other. And we must start treating each other that way, which is tantamount to say, put the Creator first, and then after the Creator, put each other next. And by doing both, we will definitely make giant strides, let alone a giant step toward our liberation as a people.
Well, that's all that I have for you. I can honestly say it's been a pleasure and an honor to learn and just hear your wise words.
Well, thank you for that. May the Creator bless you with the best.
Same.